There are moments in life when a single object holds more truth than an entire lifetime of explanation. A photograph can do it. A folded letter can do it. A familiar scent carried on a stranger's clothes can do it. But sometimes, truth lives inside something as small as a ring, silent, unassuming, waiting for the right moment to reveal a story no one was prepared to face. On a warm southern afternoon, a man found himself staring at a gold wedding band resting in the palm of a little black girl. The ring did not fit her. It hung loose on her small finger, too large and too old, carrying a history she had not lived but had inherited. It was a ring he recognized instantly, the same one he had slid onto the hand of the woman he once believed would share his entire life. A woman he had buried 12 years ago. A woman he was told had died without leaving anything behind. But that ring on the hand of a child disrupted every truth he thought he understood. It pulled at memories buried under years of grief. Memories of a love that crossed lines people still whispered about. Memories of a woman whose brilliance and courage had shaped him more than he ever admitted. And now, that ring had resurfaced, not in a jewelry box or among old belongings, but on the hand of a quiet girl who seemed too familiar in ways he could not place. To understand how two worlds collided on that quiet afternoon, we must begin with the girl. Her name was Zuri, 11 years old, tender and observant in a way that made adults underestimate her, yet silently resilient in a way that made other children look to her without knowing why. She lived with her grandmother in a small rural town where roads stretched long and opportunities stretched thin. A place where brilliance often bloomed unnoticed, where talent was seen as accidental rather than cultivated. A place where being quiet was interpreted as being unsure, and where a young black girl's gifts could be dismissed before they were ever seen. But Zuri had a gift that refused to be hidden. She understood machines, not in the technical way taught in classrooms, but in the intuitive, rhythmic way some people understand music or language. Engines spoke to her. Patterns made sense to her. A subtle shift in sound could tell her a story others could not hear. She had inherited this gift from a mother she barely remembered. A woman whose absence shaped the contours of her childhood long before she understood what loss truly meant. On the day everything changed, Zuri was carrying a grocery bag home, walking with the quiet familiarity of someone who had followed the same dirt path countless times. She noticed a Mustang pulled to the side at a small gas station, hood raised, steam ghosting into the hot air, a man pacing beside it, frustration tightening his jaw. His movements were sharp, rehearsed, and impatient in a way that suggested he was used to control, used to results, used to authority responding when he summoned it. This man was Ethan Caldwell, known across several counties, rich enough to be respected, powerful enough to be feared, and complicated enough that people spoke about him differently depending on where they stood. Some described him as meticulous, sharp, brilliant. Others labeled him cold, distant, or worse. But reputations are reflections, distorted by admiration or resentment, and seldom tell the full truth. What mattered on that day was that Ethan Caldwell, a man accustomed to solving problems with a phone call or a signature, stood helpless beside a machine he could not fix. And Zuri, a child overlooked by most adults in her town, instantly saw the problem. She whispered it to herself first, a simple observation, the kind a mechanic might make in passing, but adults rarely hear the quiet words of children the first time, or the second. So she walked closer, each step steady, not because she lacked fear, but because necessity had taught her to move with certainty. When she approached him, she told him again, the belt had slipped. He didn't listen. Her appearance, her age, her skin, all of it merged into a familiar bias that lived quietly inside him, unexamined and unintentional, but powerful enough to dismiss her expertise without a thought. He brushed her off politely, the way people often do when they believe children don't know enough to contribute. But Zuri didn't withdraw. She spoke again, simply and precisely, her voice carrying that rare kind of confidence rooted not in pride, but in understanding. Something in her steadiness made him pause, and when he finally looked beneath the hood with her words in mind, he saw she was right. And something inside him shifted. It was not humility, though humility would come later. It was confusion. Because watching her diagnose and repair the engine, awakened a memory he had not touched in years. A memory of hands that moved with the same certainty, a mind that understood machines the same way. A presence that approached problems with quiet wisdom, a presence he once loved. When Zuri finished adjusting the belt, the engine settled into a calm rhythm, as if recognizing familiar care. She wiped her hands on her dress with a kind of practiced indifference, leaving streaks of oil across her fingers, something that would have bothered most children but not her. And that's when he noticed the ring. Small, gold, engraved, too recognizable to be coincidence. The ring pulled the breath from his chest. It forced his grief, long dulled by time, back into raw awareness. It summoned the memory of Amara, her laugh, her brilliance, her aching tenderness, her silence on the night she left. It stirred questions he had buried because the answers had always seemed out of reach. But now, answers stood in front of him, wearing the ring of a woman he lost. When he asked Zuri where she got it, the simplicity of her answer cut deeper than any wound grief had ever inflicted. It was her mother's. Her mother, whose name was Amara. The world did not stop, but something inside Ethan did. The name he had not spoken in years, the name that lived in the quiet corners of his memory, was now being spoken by a child who carried pieces of her in ways that became clearer with every passing moment. Amara, the woman he loved, the woman who left without explanation, the woman whose death shattered him, the woman who, he was told, left no family behind. Yet here stood a child wearing her ring, a child with her hands, her gentleness, her gift, her quiet fire. And suddenly, the past he thought he had mourned fully began to unravel. Zuri continued speaking, unaware of the depth of what she had revealed. She explained that her grandmother told her stories, stories shaped by grief, shaped by misunderstanding, shaped by the silent fractures that form when systems fail to honor the lives of Black families with the same care afforded to others. Her grandmother had told her that Ethan abandoned Amara, that he walked away, that his absence was deliberate. The story came not from malice, but from the limited, painful fragments Mama Joe had been given. And children often inherit the stories adults create when trying to survive heartbreak. Ethan felt himself recoiling, not in anger, but in disbelief. The truth he lived was so painfully different. He had not left. He had been left without explanation. He had mourned a woman who disappeared from his life with no warning, believing she chose to walk away. He had never considered the possibility that she had been carrying a burden he never saw and fears she never voiced. Interracial love demands strength, resilience, and constant negotiation with the world outside the relationship. Amara had carried those battles quietly, too quietly, and now the consequences of that silence stood in front of him, waiting for answers he didn't yet have the language to give. He asked more questions, trying to piece together a past reshaped by new information. Zuri spoke gently about her grandmother's attempts to reach him, attempts blocked by mistrust, by lack of resources, by institutional barriers that so often silence Black voices. What might have been a simple step for Ethan had been nearly impossible for Mama Joe. As Zuri spoke, the weight of 12 years of miscommunication fell heavy between them. Ethan realized he had grieved alone, while another family endured their own version of the same loss, but with added layers of fear, injustice, and unanswered questions. Then Zuri asked the question that shaped the heart of everything that followed. Who was she to him? The question came from a place of longing, not accusation. It reflected the words she never had the chance to ask her mother. It represented the identity she had been piecing together from fragments left behind. For Ethan, it broke the last barrier between shock and truth. At that moment, the story deepened. It shifted from curiosity to accountability, from confusion to revelation. And this moment of reckoning, one shaped by race, love, loss, and long-hidden truth, became the doorway into the past he never knew existed. The child who stood before him was not simply a stranger. She was a mirror held up to everything he thought he had buried. She was the continuation of a story life had not finished telling. And this is where the real unraveling begins. The question lingered in the humid air, unanswered, heavy, and trembling with decades of silence. Who am I to you? Zuri's quiet inquiry was not a demand for identity, but a search for belonging. It carried the weight of a child trying to assemble a story she had only ever received in fragments. And for Ethan, It became the moment when reality split open, revealing everything he never knew, everything he was never told, and everything he was finally being forced to confront. Before he could respond, the rhythm of the afternoon shifted. The soft scrape of a cane approached, steady and deliberate. Zuri's grandmother, known in the town as Mama Joe, stepped forward with the authority of someone who had weathered storms far greater than this moment. Her presence was quiet, but immense, built from years of responsibility, survival, and the fierce love required to raise a child alone in a world that often delivered its harshest blows without warning. Mama Joe did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt out of anger or suspicion. She intervened because she understood that truth, raw and unsparing, can wound a child if not handled with care. She stood between Zuri and Ethan the way a bridge stands between past and present, steady, firm, and aware of the currents beneath. Her first question was simple. Did he know Amara? Not as a rumor, not as a memory softened by grief, but truly know her. Ethan's nod was slow, pained, and burdened. That acknowledgement unlocked something in Mama Joe, something resigned, something sorrowful. The years she had spent carrying the truth alone began to unspool, thread by thread. She gestured for him to sit, not as an equal, not as an adversary, but as a man who needed to hear what had been withheld from him for far too long. Mama Joe's voice carried the cadence of experience. Every word came measured, not for dramatic effect, but because truth demanded respect. She explained that Amara had been pregnant when she left, not unsure, not unaware, fully conscious of the life forming inside her. She had planned to tell him. She had written drafts of letters she never sent. She had practiced what she wanted to say in the mirror, voice shaking with both love and fear. The fear hadn't been of Ethan. It had been of the world around him. Loving him had placed her in a fragile space, caught between acceptance and rejection, between admiration and suspicion. Being a black woman loving a white man in certain parts of the South meant carrying an invisible load. Every sideways glance, every whispered rumor, every reminder that her presence in his life was questioned by people who believed their discomfort held more authority than her humanity. The night she left him, someone confronted her, not with physical harm, but with words crafted to wound. A warning that their relationship would jeopardize not only her future, but his. They told her she would never fit into his world, that she would ruin his reputation, that if she stayed, she would bring down a man who deserved better. The cruelty of that message wasn't in its bluntness, it was in its familiarity. Amara had heard versions of it her entire life, spoken by different tongues, but rooted in the same soil of racial prejudice. She left because fear pressed harder than hope. Mama Joe described the night Amara appeared on her doorstep, trembling, distraught, torn between the love she felt and the world that insisted that love had limits. She carried only a small bag, the ring no longer on her finger, and the knowledge that she was carrying a child whose future felt uncertain and unprotected. Her plan had been temporary. She wanted space to breathe, to gather courage, to return to Ethan when she felt strong enough to speak her truth. She wanted to tell him about the baby. She wanted to explain her fears, not hide them. But life rarely grants time to repair what fear has fractured. Before she could return, the accident happened. Mama Joe spoke of that night with a grief that never softened. The crash was violent, but what followed cut deeper. The authorities arrived with an indifference that revealed itself in quiet, devastating ways. They questioned her identification. They doubted her words. They treated her medical needs with a detachment that still echoed in Mama Joe's memory. And in the chaos that followed, institutional failures compounded. The hospital ignored Amara's insistence that she had a husband. They failed to contact Ethan. They misfiled her information. They handed her belongings back without care, including the ring meant for the spouse they never acknowledged. Ethan, meanwhile, was listed as unreachable. Not because he was unreachable, but because no one made the effort to reach him. The truth was not lost. It was simply never delivered. Hearing all this, Ethan felt the world tilt. Grief rose inside him with a force he had not felt since the day he learned of Amara's death. Except this grief was different. This grief was laced with betrayal, not by Amara, but by systems he had trusted without question. By the assumption that information would find him, by the belief that love, once broken, could be mourned honestly. Mama Jo continued, explaining that she had tried to find him in the months following Amara's passing, but grief, poverty, and fear formed barriers at every turn. Her distrust of institutions was not imagined. It had been earned through years of being dismissed, overlooked, and denied access to the simplest resources. Rent was due, food had to be bought, a baby had to be cared for. And grief does not pause life, it only makes every responsibility heavier. What should have been a simple process, locating a grieving husband, became an unreachable labyrinth. In that void, assumptions grew. She believed Ethan had chosen not to come. Ethan believed Amara had chosen to leave. And Zuri lived in the wake of both misunderstandings. When Mama Jo finished speaking, Ethan was silent, not because he lacked words, but because the truth had taken all of them. He realized he had spent 12 years grieving a story shaped by omissions, not lies. A story carried by two families who never had the chance to share their versions. He turned to Zuri, who watched him with guarded hope. She had been listening from a distance, absorbing more than any child should ever have to absorb. Her life had been shaped by questions that adults were finally brave enough to answer. Ethan approached her with a tenderness sharpened by revelation. He told her the truth, not the truth he was told, but the truth he now understood. He had not known about her. He had not abandoned her mother. He had not walked away from a child he never knew existed. And if he had known, he would have tried. Zuri listened quietly, her expression softening in ways subtle but profound. She wasn't looking for a perfect explanation. Children rarely are. She was searching for sincerity, presence, accountability. And in his trembling words, she found enough to take a step toward trust. She asked whether he believed she might be his daughter. It was a question shaped not by biology, but by belonging. And his response came with honesty stripped of every pretense. He spoke of her mother's strength, her gift, her way of moving through the world, reflections he now saw mirrored in Zuri. He told her it would take more than a test to convince him she wasn't connected to the love he once lost. That was when Zuri did something quiet and monumental. She slipped the ring from her finger and placed it in his hand. Not as proof, not as a plea, but as a bridge between the life she had and the life she hoped to understand. Ethan closed his hand around the ring, a symbol no longer of grief alone, but of responsibility. The shift between them was small, but powerful. Zuri asked if he would stay, even if she wasn't biologically his, a question born from a childhood shaped by uncertainty. And Ethan, finally ready to step into the truth, told her he would. That family could grow from choice, not just blood. As she leaned into him, her small frame trembling with the release of years of silence, Ethan simply stayed. For the first time in her life, she felt someone remain long enough for her tears to settle. She learned in that moment what safety could feel like when someone chose to offer it freely. When Mama Jo approached again, she carried neither resentment nor eagerness. She came with the wisdom of a woman who understood that new beginnings must be protected, not rushed. She told Ethan he could come into their home, not as a savior, not as someone seeking to rewrite the past, but as a man willing to do right by the living. Ethan accepted with a humility unfamiliar to him. He understood that healing would require more than promises, it would require presence. And so as the evening settled across the quiet town, Zuri invited him to see more of what she could fix. He followed her, witnessing with new eyes the inheritance she carried from her mother, the precision, the patience, the gentle authority over broken things. When she said the car had been through a lot, he recognized the layered meaning. She wasn't just talking about the Mustang. She was speaking of herself, of her grandmother, of the mother she never knew, and now of him. She suggested that maybe both the car and its owner needed repair, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe she might be right. The sun lowered, shadows lengthened, and 3 lives, once fractured by silence, began to move towards something like restoration. Not perfect, not easy, but possible. Even as the sun dipped below the horizon and the edges of the sky dimmed into quiet shades of amber and violet, the story unfolding at the small gas station did not loosen its grip. The air below twilight carries a different kind of truth, one softened by dusk, sharpened by memory, and revealed in ways the brightness of daylight often conceals. What lingered now was not shock, not confusion, but a dawning awareness that the paths of three lives had never been as separate as they once believed. Zuri stood beside the car she had repaired, her face touched by the gentle relief only children can express without effort. Her small hands, still smudged with oil, rested against the hood with a familiarity that belonged to someone twice her age. She had always been good with machines. But today, the same hands that restored an engine had also opened a doorway into a history she never knew she'd been living inside. Ethan remained a few steps away, the ring resting heavily in his pocket, a weight that felt strangely alive, pulsing with memories, regret, and a truth that could no longer be buried beneath grief. Every time his hand brushed against the metal, he felt the echoes of a love he once thought he understood, only to realize he had known just one side of it. And Mama Joe, standing quietly behind them, watched the shape of a new story forming, one that held hope, caution, and a responsibility she had carried alone for far too long. But every story, especially the ones shaped by loss and racial complexities, must move beyond the moment of revelation. It must walk deeper into reckoning, and reckoning is seldom gentle. As they drove to Mama Joe's home, Ethan following behind them, the landscape shifted from open roads to the narrow familiarity of a community, both humble and resilient. Houses with peeling paint leaned into one another like elders sharing burdens. Children played barefoot in yards shaped by generations of survival. The scent of earth lingered heavy in the air. It was a neighborhood where strength did not announce itself loudly, but lived in the quiet dignity of people who had learned to build entire worlds from scarcity. Ethan had driven through neighborhoods like this before, but never with the awareness that a part of his past, maybe even his child, had grown up within one of them. Zuri walked into the house with the ease of someone who understood every creaking floorboard, every chipped cup, every photograph on the wall. Ethan stepped in carefully, aware that his presence, his skin, his privilege, his history, entered the space with him. Mama Joe watched him, not with suspicion, but with the measured caution of a woman who had opened her home to a stranger who was no stranger at all. The house was small, but it held the weight of lives lived fully. Photographs lined the walls, ancestors, children, birthdays, quiet moments of joy. And among them, Ethan noticed one framed picture that stole the breath from his lungs. Amara. Not as he remembered her, dressed for a dinner or a date, positioned in the glow of their happiest years, but softer, radiant, her hand resting on her small, swelling belly, a faint smile stretching just enough to show hope she dared not speak aloud. He stepped closer, his fingers trembling as if the image might dissolve if touched too quickly. Mama Joe moved beside him, her gaze traveling across the image with a tenderness shaped by years of longing. "That was taken the night before she left," she said, not as explanation, but as a truth she had not been able to share until now. The photograph held a history Ethan had never been allowed to witness. It marked the moment Amara carried a future he never knew he was part of. And suddenly, the ring in his pocket felt less like a burden and more like a key, unlocking a version of Amara's life that had existed beyond his reach. As they settled into the living room, Zuri took a small seat near the window, watching the conversation with an attentiveness beyond her years. She had lived her life piecing together stories with gaps too wide to cross alone. Tonight, the adults in her life were finally filling those spaces, not perfectly, but honestly. Mama Joe began by sharing more of the past, this time not the tragic events, but the small, human moments that built the foundation of Amara's life. She spoke of the day Amara learned she was pregnant, the fear, the confusion, the joy she tried to hold on to, despite the storm she felt approaching. She spoke of the neighbors who whispered, the friends who withdrew, the family members caught between pride and concern. She spoke of the loneliness Amara carried after leaving Ethan, a loneliness sharpened by the belief that she had ruined her one chance at a stable future. But she also spoke of her determination, the way she held her belly and whispered promises to the child growing inside her, the way she worked 2 jobs until her body insisted she rest, the way she saved every penny she could, folding tiny baby clothes with a tenderness that reflected both hope and fear. Ethan listened, grief pressing against his chest in waves that made breathing feel impossible. Every detail reshaped his understanding of the past. Every truth challenged the assumptions he had built his healing upon, and every memory Mama Joe shared pushed him deeper into a realization that love is never as simple as the story one person carries. When Mama Joe described the day Amara went into labor, the rushed taxi ride, the prayer whispered under her breath, the determination etched into her expression, Zuri looked down at her hands. It was the first time she had heard some of these details. She had grown up knowing her mother died young, but not the story of how she lived in the days leading up to her death. Children inherit loss long before they inherit understanding. Tonight, Zuri inherited truth. The story took a heavier turn when Mama Joe described the night of the accident. The hospital, the dismissive tone of the nurse, the doctor who barely made eye contact, the mix-up in records, the inability to process her paperwork accurately, the subtle ways in which race determined the urgency, or lack thereof, of her care. These were not exaggerations. They were the lived realities of countless Black families navigating systems created without them in mind. Ethan felt the weight of this truth collide violently with the comfort of the world he had lived in, a world where institutions had always worked for him, always returned his calls, always recognized the legitimacy of his grief. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Zuri finally looked up, her eyes wet but determined. She had heard years' worth of truth in one evening, and her young mind was gathering it all with the patience of someone who had always suspected the story was bigger than what she was told. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was awakening. When Ethan met her gaze, something shifted between them. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't immediate love. It was recognition, the kind that grows from shared truth, not genetics. He told her gently that he wished he had been there, that he wished he had known, that he wished the world had given him even one small chance to understand the life forming without his awareness. Not as an excuse, not as a plea, but as an acknowledgement that the past had been shaped by forces larger than either of them. Zuri let out a slow breath. She didn't need him to rewrite the past. Children rarely ask adults to undo what has already been done. They ask only that the future be different. As the hours passed, the conversation evolved from what was lost to what might be possible. Mama Joe asked Ethan what he planned to do next, not with hostility, but with the protective insight of someone who had spent years shielding a child from uncertainty. She wasn't asking about money. She wasn't asking for promises. She was asking for intention. Ethan paused, the question settling over him like a challenge and a responsibility. For the first time, he admitted aloud, not to ease his guilt, but to affirm his understanding, that he had a part in this story now. That whether or not biology confirmed it, Zuri carried the legacy of someone he once loved with all his heart. He promised, not with dramatic assurance but with quiet sincerity, to be present, to step into this story with humility, to learn, listen, and remain consistent, to show up even when it was uncomfortable, confusing, or painful. To build trust, not through declarations, but through time. Mama Joe accepted his answer with a measured nod. She had seen men make promises before. She had also seen which men kept them, and she would be watching, carefully, compassionately, firmly. Later that night, after the conversation settled and the house grew quiet, Zuri guided Ethan to a small room filled with the remnants of her childhood, a space where her mother's memory lived in the corners, in the faint scent of old books, in the stitched edges of blankets Amara had folded before leaving for the hospital. Zuri showed him a small shoebox she kept hidden beneath the bed. Inside were the keepsakes she had collected over the years: a locket, a faded photograph, a ribbon, a handwritten note from Mama Joe with a story about Amara's first day of school. And at the very bottom, creased from being unfolded and refolded too many times, was a letter Amara had written but never sent. The ink was faded, the handwriting soft and a little uneven, the words carrying the ache of someone trying to hold two opposing truths at once: her love for Ethan and her fear of what that love demanded of her. Ethan held the letter in shaking hands. It was the closest he had come to hearing her voice in more than a decade. The letter did not apologize for leaving. It did not blame him. It simply revealed the truth she could not carry alone: that the world may not have been ready for their love, but she had hoped, desperately, that their child would inherit a world more open than the one they lived in. Zuri watched him read, her silence deeper than any words could be. She saw grief in him, but she also saw recognition, the recognition that the story of her life did not begin at loss, but at love interrupted by forces larger than the two people who tried to challenge them. When Ethan folded the letter and placed it gently back into the box, he looked at Zuri with a resolve she had never seen in an adult before. Not a resolve born from guilt, but a resolve born from clarity. He understood now. The story was no longer about what he missed. It was about what he chose to do from this moment forward. As the night deepened, Mama Jo prepared a small space for him on the living room couch. She did so not out of obligation, but with a quiet acknowledgement that he was now part of something fragile and in need of care. And so, under the gentle hum of a house shaped by love and loss, Ethan lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, heart heavy with revelation, mind restless with possibility. He wasn't thinking about DNA. He wasn't thinking about legality or logistics. He was thinking about the little girl who fixed engines with the same calm precision as the woman he once loved. He was thinking about Zuri. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, that the ring in his pocket had never been a symbol of ending. It had always been a symbol of continuation. Outside, the crickets sang in the warm darkness. Inside, a man who had once believed his story ended 12 years ago realized he was standing at the beginning of an entirely new chapter. A chapter shaped not by certainty, but by truth. Not by perfection, but by intention. Not by blood alone, but by connection. And as the moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows across the room, one truth became undeniable. Healing had begun. Not loudly, not perfectly, but gently, in the hands of a child who had spent her life repairing broken things. This story was far from finished. The reckoning was not complete. But for the first time, all three of them were finally standing in the same truth. And the next steps, however difficult, would be taken together. Morning arrived gently over the small southern neighborhood, unfolding in soft layers of warmth and muted birdsong. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of Mama Jo's home, stretching across the quiet living room where Ethan had spent the night lying awake, absorbing the truth that had reshaped the entire landscape of his past. The world beyond those thin walls was already moving, neighbors sweeping porches, children preparing for school. But inside, everything felt suspended between sorrow and possibility. It takes time for a person to adjust to the weight of a new truth, especially when that truth threads itself through grief, race, and the fragile memories of a love that once felt invincible. As Ethan sat up, the ache in his chest wasn't simply emotional exhaustion. It was the realization that nothing in his life would ever return to the way it had been before yesterday. And for the first time, that thought didn't terrify him. It clarified him. Across the hallway, Zuri stirred quietly. Mama Jo helped her braid her hair, smoothing the curls with gentle fingers. There was something different in the way Zuri moved that morning. Not lighter, not heavier, but more grounded. Children rarely articulate transformation in words. They show it in their posture, their silence, their willingness to stand closer to a person they once observed from a distance. What Zuri carried now was not a complete understanding of where she came from, but the beginning of connection. Connection to a man who had stepped into her story, not with certainty, but with intention. Ethan emerged into the kitchen, where Mama Jo stood preparing breakfast. She didn't speak right away, nor did she offer the easy comforts people often provide in moments of transition. Instead, she allowed the silence to exist between them, honoring the complexity of everything that had happened. Silence, when honored, can serve as both a bridge and a boundary. Eventually, she acknowledged his presence with a nod, an invitation for him to sit, to let the day begin without rushing into solutions or expectations. The morning unfolded with a quietness that felt almost sacred. Zuri joined them at the table, her movements tentative yet hopeful. The three of them shared the kind of simple meal that holds deeper meaning, not because of what is eaten, but because of who is there to witness it. After breakfast, Mama Jo led Ethan to a small cabinet in the living room. Inside were the items she had preserved from Amara's life: photographs, hospital paperwork, a few journal entries, and mementos that carried the texture of a life lived fully but shortened abruptly. She offered them to him gently, letting him decide when and how to absorb each one. One item stood out, a folded document from the hospital. It was a copy of the report that contained errors so subtle yet so damaging that they redirected the course of an entire family's history. The misspelled name, the incorrect next of kin information, the failure to record her insistence that she had a husband waiting for her. These mistakes were not unusual in institutions that too often misunderstand or overlook Black patients, but their consequences had been devastating. Holding the paperwork, Ethan felt a wave of grief wash through him, not only for Amara, but for the child and the grandmother who had carried the weight of that oversight for 11 years. Racism does not always announce itself with slurs or violence. Sometimes it appears in the margins of paperwork, in the apathy of systems that do not listen, in the quiet negligence that reshapes lives. It would have been easy for Ethan to spiral into guilt, for guilt is the quickest refuge of those who benefit from privilege. But he resisted the impulse. This was not the moment for self-punishment. It was the moment for accountability. And accountability, real accountability, is shaped through action rather than emotion. He returned the documents to the cabinet and met Mama Joe's eyes. In that silent exchange, she recognized that he understood something deeper, not only the personal loss, but the structural one. It was an understanding she had been waiting for, not because she needed an apology from him, but because she needed him to see the landscape that shaped her daughter's final days. Zuri approached him quietly, clutching a small notebook filled with her own sketches. She had drawn engines, gears, bolts, and elaborate diagrams of machines imagined in her mind. Ethan flipped through the pages slowly, realizing that her gift was not merely inherited but nurtured, carefully, consistently, lovingly, by the grandmother who raised her and the mother whose memory lived within her. The drawings symbolized something larger, that Zuri had built a world from fragments, constructing understanding where adults had left gaps. She had taught herself how things worked because she needed to make sense of a life that did not always offer clarity. Later that afternoon, they walked together through the neighborhood. Children played in yards, cracked by sun and time. Elderly residents watched the world from porches shaped by history. Every step revealed pieces of the environment that had shaped Zuri's upbringing, an environment that carried hardship, but also resilience, community, intergenerational strength. As they walked, Zuri pointed out the houses where neighbors had helped raise her, women who braided her hair on Sunday mornings, men who taught her how to ride a bike, families who offered meals when times were hard. These were the people who filled the void Ethan never knew he left. Yet instead of feeling threatened by their presence in her life, he felt grateful. They had carried her forward when he could not. There are forms of love that do not vanish simply because the world disrupts them. There are forms of family that do not dissolve because a chapter ends too soon. What mattered now was how he showed up in the chapters yet to be written. In the days that followed, Ethan returned to his own home only briefly, long enough to gather the space he needed for reflection. He read through old journals Amara had kept during their time together, rediscovering pieces of her voice he had forgotten. He reviewed places they once shared, not to relive the past, but to understand how their story had evolved beyond what either of them could have predicted. He sat with the ring often, turning it between his fingers, feeling its history reshape itself in his hands. It no longer belonged to a time that was lost. It belonged to a time being rebuilt. When he returned to Mama Joe's doorstep days later, he did so not as a grieving widower, but as a man who had chosen to step into responsibility. Zuri greeted him with quiet excitement, her expression softening in a way that revealed trust had begun to take root. Over the next weeks, they built a rhythm that was neither forced nor rushed. He helped Zuri with small projects, fixing bicycles, tinkering with old lawnmowers, exploring the engines left in neighbors' garages. She guided him with the authority of someone who understood machines intimately, and he followed her lead without pride or pretense. For the first time in years, she felt the presence of an adult who saw her fully. Mama Joe observed their connection with careful attention. She never interfered, never pushed, never held back truth. She simply watched the slow stitching of a family forming across the lines of loss and time. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when Zuri withdrew, unsure how deeply she could trust. Moments when Ethan questioned whether he had the right to step into her life so late. Moments when the past felt too heavy to carry. But with each day, the distance between them softened. The DNA test eventually came, not as a dramatic breaking point, but as a quiet confirmation. The results were conclusive. Zuri was not biologically his. But the news did not land the way Zuri feared. It did not change Ethan's commitment or reduce his presence. Instead, it removed the weight of uncertainty from the space between them, paving the way for a relationship shaped not by biology, but by intention. Family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by who stays, who listens, and who loves with consistency. In the months that followed, Ethan formally petitioned to share guardianship responsibilities, not to replace Mama Jo, but to support her. He invested in Zuri's education, ensuring her gift with mechanics could evolve into opportunity. He took her to workshops, introduced her to engineers, and encouraged her brilliance rather than letting it be dismissed as a hobby. Mama Jo watched these developments with gratitude, tempered by realism, aware that the world does not change overnight, but believing fully in the change they were creating together. Zuri's life grew larger, her confidence grew deeper, her world expanded beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood that raised her. And Ethan's life, once shaped by grief and guilt, began to take on a new meaning, one rooted not in what he lost, but in what he chose to build. As the story draws to a close, it becomes clear that its power does not lie in revelation alone. Its power lies in reflection. Reflection on what it means to love across boundaries, to confront the truths we inherit, and to rebuild in the places where life has fractured. Some stories do not end with perfect symmetry. They end with possibility, with a door left open, with a family learning to grow in the spaces where pain once lived. This story is one of those. And as the narrator's voice lingers over the final image, one truth resonates quietly. Family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the people who show up when you finally have the courage to tell the truth. If this story touched you in any way, consider sharing your reflections in the comments below. Someone else may be living a version of this journey, waiting for a reminder that healing is possible. This has been our Black Diary, where every story finds a home.